We tend to associate certain hormones with different bodily functions. For example, when we think of our sex hormones, estradiol and progesterone, we associate them with our period and reproduction. But our hormones have a widespread effect on several different systems in the body. One hormone that we typically always associate with one process and one process only is melatonin. When we think of melatonin, we only think about its relationship with sleep, which is very important, but there's so much more to this little hormone, melatonin. In the last few years, especially since COVID, there has been a crazy rise and trend with the use of melatonin. Everything from really high doses of melatonin to just a crazy amount of sales on melatonin supplements, like almost doubled since COVID. So I have asked my guest today to come on to give us the rundown on all things melatonin. Dr. Deanna Minich is a certified functional medicine practitioner with a master's of science degree in human nutrition and a doctorate in medical sciences. She is an international lecturer, educator, and author with over 20 years of experience in academia and in the food and dietary supplement industries, currently serving as chief science officer at Symphony Natural Health. Through her talks, workshops, groups, and in-person retreats, she helps people to practically and artfully transform their lives through nutrition and lifestyle. You can find her at deannaminich.com. And welcome to the show, Deanna.
Wow, what a great way to introduce the topic about hormones and how they're connected to all these functions. And melatonin is one of those magical miracle type of hormones that's not really a hormone in its very, I would say, like basic foundational use. And we're going to talk about a lot of that. So great to be here with you.
Oh, yeah, I'm so excited. I've heard you speak on several podcasts, and I just loved how much you knew about melatonin because there's not a lot of like people going deep on melatonin, except for maybe
Mhm.
kind of the opposite, which is the high dose melatonin, which kind of came out of the whole COVID thing, right? It was like COVID happened and everyone's going, oh my gosh, start dosing yourself with all these high dose melatonin, which we will get into the pros and cons of that. But let's just start out with just some basics because as you just said, melatonin is not even essentially maybe a hormone, which that's just nuts
Well,
out.
it's not, oh, let me rephrase that. It's not only a
Okay.
hormone. I think it wears many hats. And so if we think of this molecule, like depending on where it's made and what time it's produced, it just wears a lot of different functions. And I think that, when you mention about people using high doses because of COVID or long COVID, then you also have the other end of the spectrum where people fear melatonin because they think it's a hormone and they only see it as a hormone. So that's why I couch it within the context that it truly is something bigger. It's greater than that. So first and foremost, I mean, melatonin is an ancient molecule. It's been referred to as such in the scientific literature. It's been around a long time. It's goodness, it's in plants, it's in animals, just like it is in us, and it's throughout the entire body. And if we look at what is it from a structure perspective, it is what is referred to in chemistry as an indoleamine. So it has some of the, I would say that the structure, if you look at tryptophan, tryptophan is an amino acid, and amino acids make up proteins. So tryptophan has this very similar kind of aromatic structure. Tryptophan converts to serotonin, which we all know of as like the kind of the happy neurotransmitter or that neurotransmitter that gives us a sense of contentment. And then serotonin converts to melatonin. So if we just think about how it is produced in the body, like kind of that pathway, protein from the tryptophan, serotonin, melatonin, and that'll make its way into the discussion. So, back in the, I think it was like the late 1950s, it was being just like looked at and explored for its potential skin whitening uh, agent or properties. And so a Yale dermatologist was looking into this molecule at that time, but as it turned out, it didn't really do much in the way of skin lightening. It did other things. And so, it's produced throughout the body. So it's not just from the pineal gland. Most people think of, the connection with circadian rhythm and with sleep. And we'll get into that, but it's also made throughout the body. In the cell itself, it's made in high amounts relatively in the mitochondria. And we'll talk about why that is. And then separate from the endocrine aspect of the pineal gland and thinking of the cell, it's also made within the gut. And in fact, in the gut, you have exponentially more melatonin that's made compared to the pineal gland. So in darkness, the pineal gland is triggered through the eyes, through that darkness signal, to then make melatonin, which then is used systemically and goes to the cells of the body to basically key into the clock genes to get us syncing to that sleep-wake rhythm. Now, the melatonin that's made in the gut is a little bit different. So it works more, at least we think this, and I think that more research is coming out on the gut. It has potentially more of an autocrine or paracrine effect, where it's working locally or maybe even within the cell that it's produced. And the response to making that melatonin is a little bit different. It's not made in the same way like the pineal gland in response to darkness. It's typically made in response to the meal response. So it's produced differentially.
So going back to, it's made from tryptophan and serotonin and then melatonin, is that process only through the gut, and then the pineal gland itself will just produce the melatonin?
So we have tryptophan in our bodies, localized in certain areas. And so, yes, in the brain, we would have tryptophan that would then sequentially convert into melatonin, and the same in the gut. So it needs to come from that tryptophan source, unless it's ready-made melatonin that we're taking in. So some people think, oh, well, I'm just going to eat more turkey, more tryptophan, and I'll just like front load my melatonin and get it that way. The way that the conversion works from tryptophan into melatonin, it's not always so perfectly streamlined going from A to B to C. There are many enzymes that are connected into that conversion. And in addition to the enzymes, as we know, many times you need nutrient cofactors. So you need several nutrients. So if you're deficient in a nutrient, or maybe you have a gene variant for one of the enzymes happens to be a methyltransferase. So we know all of the issues that people have with methylation in general. That's one that it's something that requires nutrients if we have a gene variant. So even though we could say, well, let's just get more protein, and I think we do need to be thinking about protein. I think that is an important element. There's a lot of competition of those amino acids to get into the brain, right? That blood-brain barrier is very selective. And so then we have that we have to think about. So it's the conversion of tryptophan to melatonin is one factor. And the second factor to think about is how much of that tryptophan can cross the blood-brain barrier. It can compete with other amino acids. And then thirdly, taking in melatonin in its full form, whether from food or a supplement, would be one of the ways to have a targeted molecule. And because melatonin is both lipid soluble and it's water soluble, it can cross different membranes with ease, and it can move through the body systems.
Wow. Okay. I got
I'll
it.
stop there.
Everybody else did too.
You might want to play back some of those pieces, right?
Yeah. So if somebody has a compromised gut system, will that affect their production of melatonin in the gut mucosa?
Potentially. I think that's one thing. Sure. I think that there's been less done on gut-derived melatonin than perhaps pineal-derived. One of the things that can blunt somebody's production of melatonin, things, but I'll give one big one. It's stress. So it's having any kind of hormonal imbalances, actually. So the thing about tryptophan is that tryptophan is highly regarded in the body as the source to get to energy. Energy meaning NAD. So the NAD that fuels a lot of metabolic cycles. So during times of stress, when we may need more energy currency, we draw upon that tryptophan and we leverage that through that energy pathway. Now, if we are stressed, sometimes we can go further within that pathway into what's referred to as a kynurenine pathway, where we start to make more, I would say, less neuroprotective compounds and more neurotoxic. So we have essentially less tryptophan left over in order to make that precious melatonin. So when people are stressed, so anytime, I mean, I love that your focus is on hormones, because anytime that we tug on a hormone, like if we're tugging on cortisol and we are imbalanced in our cortisol, we are going to imbalance melatonin. We are going to imbalance, I mean, that particular relationship is really very tightly wired. And we know that because, cortisol is high in the morning. Melatonin is high in the pinnacle of darkness at night, like 2 to 4 a.m. So if there's any disruption of that circadian flow of hormones, and now maybe you don't have that cortisol peak in the morning, or you have an exacerbated cortisol peak, and maybe that's coming at night, that's going to throw off kind of the rhythmic flow of hormones like melatonin. But just back to your question about the gut, I think it is a really good question, because any kind of gut inflammation, dysbiosis, it's going to have a ripple through effect as well. I just think that the focus on melatonin has been strongly connected to the sleep-wake cycle, and the type of melatonin where it's produced in the body that connects to that is the pineal gland, which is in the brain, that derived melatonin, which is coming from tryptophan.
Have you read any of Dr. Stasha Gomanak's work?
I have not. I don't believe
I'm gonna
so.
have to send. I interviewed her years ago, and she has a sleep program, and everything is about the gut. I have to go back because this was back in probably 2019, so it's a bit fuzzy as to exactly the mechanisms that she's talking about. But she talks about the effects of the gut microbiome on sleep and how it relates to B vitamins and vitamin D. And so I'm wondering
Makes
if there's
sense.
something in there. Yeah, I'm gonna have to go back and listen to it, but that's her big thing. And so I'm just thinking, like, if the methylation process, which relies on the methylated Bs, and we're talking, the gut microbiome and how this could affect sleep. So it could all, maybe tie in together. I'll link to that episode in the show notes because I'm going to go back and listen
Yeah.
to it myself. But
Yeah, it's worthwhile. I mean, we know
yeah,
that any kind of inflammation would impact sleep, right? And then we
yeah.
also know, I mean, there could be multiple factors. Even low blood sugar can impact sleep.
Mhm.
When you exercise that day can impact sleep. Your caffeine consumption can affect sleep. So, the gut is a portal to the brain. And so,
Mhm.
there's so much now being done on the gut-brain axis.
Mhm.
And it could be more than melatonin too. It might be, a phytochemical deficiency that we have,
Mhm.
where we just don't have enough fodder for the gut microbiome to make metabolites that are actually signaling to the brain to reduce inflammation. So yeah, I
Yeah,
think it's pretty complex.
it
And I don't
is.
want, even though melatonin is a quite remarkable molecule and does so many things, I don't want to chalk everything up to melatonin. I think that there's a lot of complexity, and melatonin hinges on things like we were just talking about, like on cortisol, but also on vitamin D. So
Yeah.
that review paper that we wrote back in September 2022,
Mhm.
the title of the article was, "Is Melatonin the Next Vitamin D?" And there was
Mhm.
even a study looking at how people who were vitamin D insufficient or deficient also had issues with their melatonin status. And when the vitamin D status was corrected, that helped to correct some of the melatonin status. So you see how
Mhm.
everything, and we used to think that vitamin D was a vitamin, hence its name, right? And now
Yeah,
we know,
yeah.
well, vitamin D does a lot more. It flexes. You know what I would call these things too, especially vitamin D and melatonin? I would even call them circadian nutrients. I've referred to them
Right.
as that before, because
Yeah.
I don't think, and I think that there are more circadian nutrients. You spoke about B vitamins. One of the B vitamins, vitamin B2, which is riboflavin, is required for one of the enzymes that's involved in that cellular oscillatory cycle of the day and night rhythm. And so
Okay.
there is one of those enzymes, they're called cryptochromes. Cryptochromes require riboflavin for that cell to make its like going from the day cycle to the night cycle. So just think of it. If we're low in B vitamins, which we know give us energy in more than one way, especially through, just even the tricarboxylic acid cycle, just harnessing energy that way, that's pivotal. We need B vitamins for methylation, but what we also need riboflavin specifically for is those cryptochromes, which come together with another transcription factor and then go on again at that cellular level. So just think of it. I mean, any nutrient could stop us from fulfilling our circadian system needs. I don't even think
Yeah.
about it as a rhythm. To me, it's a system. We have
Yeah.
an internal wired system that essentially makes us in rhythmic motion with the cycles of nature. And I think that where we start to see symptoms is where we have misalignment with that internal oscillation of that rhythmic pattern, where all of a sudden we might turn it on its head and we might do shift work, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
Or we might travel a lot and we might be jet lagged all the time. That's really hard to recover from. And then
Yeah.
what about even other types of professions like X-ray technicians who are in darkness a lot,
Yeah.
or miners who are in a mine and don't have access to light during the day. So anytime I think, and there are some workarounds, of course, it's not saying that people should just quit their jobs immediately, but I
Yeah.
would say when you are in those susceptible, more vulnerable states of being potentially in misalignment,
Yeah.
all the more reason to care for your circadian system, to be sure that you have adequate nutrients, especially the melatonin that we're talking about, the vitamin D, riboflavin, other B vitamins, that you're getting enough tryptophan, that you get protein throughout the day. I think it's essential, because
Mhm.
otherwise, when you flip nature on its head like that and you start to come at it from a different angle, it's harder for the body to accommodate. I don't think
Yeah.
everybody's constitution enables them to do that very easily.
Yeah. People really, I think, need to put focus on that are in those environments, because we know the long-term research shows that they do tend to get more illness and die earlier, like horrible things, and I don't want to, be the Debbie Downer and freak everybody out, but yeah, don't run out and quit your job, but it just shows the importance of paying attention to that circadian health, I think. And everything you just said, maybe some of it might go over my listener's head a little bit, but I think the bottom line, the takeaway from what you were just saying is mind the fact that all of these processes, these hormones, these nutrients, these amino acids work synergistically. They
Yeah.
impact each other. It's this massive system that if you do one thing to one specific process, you will be affecting all of these other systems in a
Yeah.
roundabout
And
way.
to that point, I want to just shine a light on one particular nutrient that it's kind of like the old adage, if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So during the pandemic, what became the nail? It was vitamin D. Let's get more vitamin D, hammering on vitamin D. Let's get more sunlight, more vitamin D. Well, when we do supraphysiological levels of vitamin D,
Which people
we
were
actually,
doing, like
which people were
20,
doing.
50,000 IU, 100,000. I heard like massive amounts coming from people like, oh, I'm taking 50,000. I'm like, whoa, whoa.
And in some cases, that might be warranted under a clinician's supervision because people might have gene variants or maybe their levels are low, but it's really smart to test and not guess. But what I was going to say about the vitamin D, when people overshoot like that potentially
Mhm.
with a vitamin or a mineral or whatever it is, you can actually cause deficiency in other nutrients that relate to the metabolism of that particular nutrient. So as an example, with vitamin D, when people do very high levels, but then they have very low magnesium, they can perpetuate and cause a further deficiency of magnesium, because magnesium is required for the 2-hydroxylase enzymes that activate vitamin D in your body. So when you take that supplement in, you still need to, you have the liver, the kidney activate that to make it body ready. And so, yeah, I think it's just something for us to be thinking about, like when depending on the supplement you take, of course. So, or if you're trying to get it from the skin, if you're getting a high dose, you still need the magnesium in order to convert it to make it ready.
Yeah, there's so many just blanket recommendations for everybody. Like take high doses glutathione, take high doses vitamin D. And I just did a genetic report and interviewed Kashif Khan from the DNA company. And he went through my report and he was like, oh, you do not process vitamin D very well. Like you have to take it in small doses throughout the day, not high doses, because your body will not process it properly. And I was like, there you go. And then he said the same thing about glutathione. He's like, you cannot take glutathione. And I'm like, how many practitioners out there are like, let's throw in an IV of glutathione?
True.
Let's give you 50,000 IU of vitamin D a day for your immune system. And we have to think about each individual body and how our genetics are and what this is doing to all of the other processes in the body, and is that safe for you? And I think there is, of course, a time and a place to use these things in higher doses. If you got COVID, it was recommended to take 50,000 IU a day for 3 days of vitamin D. And I could see that would probably really help. Long term, probably not. So this is a good segue into the whole high dose melatonin. So that is really what we saw
since we're talking about dose
out of the COVID thing was high dose melatonin. I've heard a lot of different podcasters and doctors and people talking about high dose melatonin. And when I say high dose, I'm saying anywhere I've heard from 100 milligrams to 300 milligrams.
Whoa.
Oh, yes. Yep. And to take it long term, like every single day. And this is going past COVID time where they're still recommending that high dose. Number one, how much melatonin do we normally produce in the body?
Yeah, let's start there, because we'd want to know, like, what does the body produce physiologically? So if we go back to looking specifically at the pineal gland and how much it produces at night, and we track that. During the day, you're not producing anything from the pineal gland, but at night, as it starts to get dimmer and dimmer, you start to produce more. So when you add up that area under the curve, like the total amount of melatonin that your pineal gland is secreting in order to help you with your sleep-wake cycle, when you are a child, it's about 0.9 to 1 milligram. So it's that's going to be the highest level that you'll ever have in your life. Usually from the age of 3 months and then on through childhood, that's when levels are the highest. As children go through puberty, those levels start to come on down. And as we start to make our way into middle age, let's just say we're about 35, that 1 milligram goes down to 0.3 milligrams, roughly around there. That depends on the individual, of course, a lot of different things, but we're looking at a middle-aged person is about 0.3 milligrams. Then let's just say you're in your 50s. Now you're down to like 0.1 milligrams. So you are really bottoming out. So when I mention that amount, and if we just talk about replenishment, repletion, and usually when we think of replenishing hormones, many times we want to get a woman back, like especially if we're using bioidentical hormone replacement therapy, or we look to like what levels did she have when she was cycling and before she went through perimenopause, right? Because every woman, every person is very unique in what was their baseline. Not everybody shares exactly the same there's a huge range many times for different actives, right?
Yeah.
So if we just think of that when we were children, our pineal glands were making about 1 milligram, 0.9 to 1 milligram. And then we drop that down to 0.3. This is why I think just patching, it's kind of like a road. You want to patch the potholes. So as you get older, you get more potholes. You
Hmm.
need to be filling those gaps and like filling that in with sand, with rocks, just to
Yeah.
be thinking like, how do you drive the car of your life on a smooth surface so you don't have a rocky night of sleep or you don't feel like inflamed, right?
Hmm.
So I think that we are filling the potholes by having a 0.3 milligram dose just to kind of get us back on track.
Yeah.
I think that
To a
that's
good
like a
dose,
healthy
to a good
range.
dose. Yeah, yeah. It's like the
Yeah,
sex hormones. We don't want to go these crazy high doses. And then we also, though, don't want to just go, here's your absolute minimal dose either, because that typically doesn't make somebody feel good. We want that nice in between that,
yeah,
gets rid of the symptoms, helps you to be healthier. But a lot of people will say, well, isn't it natural to lose these hormones, including melatonin? That has to be in that category of, well, isn't it natural for us to lose these hormones? And it's like, yes, it is, but we're also living longer than we've ever lived before. So
yep.
our body, I feel like, just isn't built for that. We start to die. We used to live to about 45, 50. Like that was the average age, right? And so it's not natural that our hormones drop and that we continue to live. And so I think, yes,
Yeah.
we top it up to function at our best.
I would absolutely agree with you. There are so many reasons one would want to replenish melatonin. And what ends up happening is that people actually develop symptoms. So when they go through perimenopause, they stop sleeping so well. They have
Yeah.
hot flashes, night sweats, their sleep is disrupted, their core body temperature is not regulated in the same way. They might have more inflammation, they might have more oxidative stress. Like they're just off. They're off physically. And it's so interesting how many women, I'm on the tail end of now reaching that menopause day, and then I'll be postmenopausal. So I've actually been going through it myself in the way of having this experience and just knowing that my body is very different from other people's bodies, like my sister and how she's experiencing it. So it's really intriguing, and you have to kind of honor your own process and personalize accordingly. But I think that it's not until people start having symptoms where they feel like, oh, I have more pain, I have more inflammation. What happened? Why am I getting hip pain and I never had an injury? Or like, I slept like a baby my whole life. Why all of a sudden can I not sleep through the night? I have the 3 a.m. wake up. So for everybody, I think it's time to look under the hood to help them symptomatically to live a better quality of life, right? Because if you don't patch those gaps, it's just like you can't really function. You can't live your best life. You can't work and feel like you're productive. You have brain fog. You can't even exercise because you don't even have the energy. So I think to your point, we are living longer. More of us are symptomatic. People are going through menopause earlier in life than they have. And people's lifestyles are just not in sync with the natural rhythm as maybe some other generations. Like if I think of my grandparents, they were farmers. They lived in Wisconsin.
Yeah.
They had a dairy farm. They rose with the sun. They, went to actually my great grandparents, actually, not my grandparents, but my grandparents grew up on that farm. So they kind of still had that imprint. So we are not that.
We are so
We
not
are
that.
on we are on phones. We are on computers. I'm talking to you through a digital interface, and that's where we spend most of
With
our
the
time.
bright,
And
bright lights shining in our face of
bright
artificial
lights
lighting.
and all of those things are changing our hormones. In fact, I just gave a talk this past weekend at this Dr. Jeff Bland's conference, and one of the things that I mentioned in my talk was that I think that one of the most societally accepted endocrine disruptors is artificial blue light.
Yeah. Yep.
It's really toxic
Yep.
because and I even have here at my desk, I've got all of my blue light blocking glasses. I mean, right now it's like, in the morning, and you want blue enriched light in the morning. That's okay. But as it starts to become dim outside, and if I'm still on the computer, I'm wearing those glasses,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
And I'm
Yep.
going to dim my screen,
Yep.
and I'm going to try as much as possible to curtail my activities at night, and or I also advocate that people change the bulbs of their
Yes, me too.
electric fixtures, right? Like you
Yeah.
have more red hue instead of blue hue because, we still have to live. We're not all going to go to bed at 6 p.m.
Yeah.
But we can hack our environment to make it better for our circadian biology.
Yeah. So let's go back to the high dose melatonin. We
Oh,
got
yeah,
off
yeah, yeah,
track there,
yeah.
which is great, which is great.
Yeah.
What is when we're taking, upwards of 100, which is almost 100 times what we produce. Sometimes some people are taking 300. What is that doing to other systems in the body over time?
Well, I think again, it gets into this topsy-turvy, like an imbalanced endocrine web. One of the things that I hear from people who take high dose melatonin. So, okay, just even at this conference, I had people coming up to me telling me about their melatonin experience. And a handful of people came up to me and said, Deanna, I took melatonin and it worked great. And then all of a sudden it stopped working. What happened? And then they stopped taking it for certain, like whether it was weeks or months, and then they started it up again, then it started working. And I said, how high was your dose? Because one of the things that can happen with high dose melatonin is that you can saturate those cellular receptors, right? Then the melatonin is not coming off the receptor. So how does the cell receive the signal? The way that hormones work and the way that we're talking about melatonin right now is truly as an endocrine hormone. So this would apply that you have the receptor on the cell, it fits in, and at some point when the light changes, right, or when the signals are changing, that melatonin releases and then goes to be metabolized and excreted. So if we are constantly hitting that signal of the receptor, bzz, it's kind of like it's of course going to stop working. Like we're going to have like it. I just don't think that long term, and I mentioned long term because there can be times where a higher dose melatonin for acute settings in certain patient populations would be warranted.
Mm-hmm.
There's exploration into long COVID, there's exploration into certain kinds of cancers, there's exploration into certain other types of looking at cognitive issues, neurodegenerative issues, but this is not for like your average person who, is just trying to have a more functional life. I do think that you can start to see some issues. And we actually don't know. There aren't a lot of studies. There are no studies, to my knowledge, actually looking at triple digit melatonin over an extended period of time, let alone double digit.
Yeah.
Like when you start to go above 10 milligrams, there's less and less research to start to support the safety of that for just daily use, right?
Yeah.
There's much more research at like 5 milligrams and all the way down even to 0.1 milligram. You see much more like where the safety profile is, you feel much more comfortable about that. And if you just crank the numbers like we just did and just talked about what the pineal gland produces, it makes a lot of sense just to replenish.
Yeah.
Like don't overdo it. It's kind of like, I often tell people it's like the Goldilocks principle. Not too little, not too much, just right for that individual. So what I say is you start with that at 0.3 milligrams. And it sounds like you and I both like herbatonin, which is a plant melatonin, right?
Yeah.
It's bioidentical melatonin, and it's got a lot of other plant compounds that amplify its response just over and beyond a regular synthetic melatonin. So that has been studied. So starting with 0.3 milligrams as like the baseline dose, seeing how a person responds. Now, I'm going to share with your listeners something that I did. So I was doing 0.3, but as I started to get into the thick of perimenopause and I was hot, one of the things that melatonin also does that doesn't get acknowledged is that it is a hypothermic agent, which means that it helps to reduce core body temperature. So, like before you go to bed at night, how you kind of get a little chilled.
Yes.
I don't know if you do. I do.
I always do.
And
yes.
I put on my cozy robe and it's like I put the blanket on. It's like that to me is telling me it's like the sign of melatonin, right? It's kind of like, hey, it's bedtime. You're cooling down. We sleep best when we're in a cool room, not too cold where we can't sleep. It's again the Goldilocks. It has to be, but we can't, it's more difficult, I think, to sleep in like heat, like very hot conditions, right? So I was going through perimenopause, I was finding that my core body temperature was indeed going up.
Yes.
I was having those hot flashes at night. So I scaled up from my zero point 0.3 and I started to stage it up until I got to 3 milligrams.
Okay.
And 3 milligrams for me was extremely helpful. By that time, I was really patching where I needed to be. And I was also thinking, like, gosh, why am I flashing at night? And as you look at the literature on why some women get hot flashes and night sweats and other women don't,
Yeah.
you start reading about, oh, inflammation, oh, cardiovascular. And
Yes.
then I was thinking, okay, so the melatonin is helping me not only to patch over sleep from my symptom perspective, but from a mechanism perspective. I obviously had exhibited more in terms of this imbalance or this dysfunction, or even I would propose inflammation. And I
Hmm.
did have a lot of types of inflammatory things. Like I was the person where I have not had injuries, and all of a sudden, like my low back started aching.
Yeah. Very
And it was like
common.
I had to change my activity. It's like, what the heck? Where did
Yeah.
that come from? I've been like an exerciser, but it's like, okay, I did a lot of yoga. I didn't do a lot of strength training. So you just have to be on the pulse of changing things. So just back to your conversation about dose, zero point 0.3 for most people. Like for my husband, works great. That's his max. He's not a person that goes up in that, because like if he doesn't do it properly and doesn't take it at a certain time, he feels kind of groggy. Like his body is slower to metabolize melatonin. So that's
Hmm.
another symptom of like, if people get groggy from melatonin, it could be that they haven't taken the dose at the proper time and that their metabolism might be delayed. His metabolism is, I'm a fast
Me
metabolizer
too.
overall. Yeah. So I would say, for most people, if they're not perimenopausal, starting with that zero point 0.3 and then work your way up from there. Then if you feel like, oh, that's okay, but I need a little bit more, then go to 0.6, right?
Hmm.
Then if you feel like, oh, that's almost there, but not quite, 0.9. So you just, you stage it up. And then that is more of a personalized dose. And you can do other things too, like being that it's fat soluble and water soluble, if you want to delay the herbatonin release a bit more, you would take it with a little bit of fat. So a colleague of
Okay.
mine takes his herbatonin with his fish oil. He takes that at
Perfect.
night,
Yeah.
which
Yeah.
is I think that's a good idea. For some people who don't want a fish oil at night,
Hmm.
they could take it with a little almond butter, or,
That's what I was thinking.
just a little bit
Omega
of
3. I got like a liquid omega 3 that would be good with
perfect.
it. Yeah, yeah. Do you think we should be taking it at dinner time? Because is that typically when melatonin after dinner, if it's at least when we're in, where I am, it's dark right now at 5. And
Right.
so it's like, do we go with the light outside? So if it starts to get dark at dinner, are we taking our melatonin then at dinner to be more in tune with our circadian rhythm? Or is it still better to take it like 8 o'clock?
Well, the traditional use of melatonin, and this is like for everybody without the nuance of knowing what your kinetics and metabolism would be, right? But for everybody, the typical use would be to take it 40 to 60 minutes before bedtime in
Okay.
case you do get that sleepy effect.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
You don't want to be like sleepy, you're starting to get sleepy while you're having dinner, but actually to that point, because my husband is a slower metabolizer, he would just love
Hmm.
me telling his whole thing. He wouldn't mind really, but
I know. I always talk about my
because he's
husband.
slower in his metabolism, he actually takes it when he gets home from work, which is
Yep.
about 8 p.m. He doesn't go to bed until he's a late, I go to bed early. He goes to bed later at about midnight. So he still has about 4 hours before he's actually going to bed. So for people who have a slower metabolism of melatonin, it would be better that you kind of find your sweet spot. Because with him, I tried out like, okay, let's do 2 hours before bedtime. That wasn't enough. 3 hours before bedtime. He felt like his sweet spot was about 4 hours before bedtime.
Yeah. It would be out of my system, long gone by 4 hours.
Yeah.
No way.
Well, and if people drink, so let me enter in another variable, and that is coffee. So when people drink coffee, Here's a good way to tell if you're a fast or slow metabolizer. So when I drink coffee, I don't get any kind of buzz. I don't get any kind of kick from that caffeine. My husband does because, again, like he has that extended effect of the caffeine, like he metabolizes slower. The same enzyme that metabolizes caffeine metabolizes melatonin. So think of it that
Okay.
way.
Yeah. Yeah.
However
And I'm
you
a fast
normally metabolize
metabolizer.
caffeine,
Yeah.
yeah, might be. So
Caffeine.
that's why if you take a cup of coffee at the same time as melatonin, you can actually change the metabolism of melatonin. You can create this competitive nature with that enzyme. So you could have a delayed response in some ways of the melatonin. So for people who are afternoon coffee drinkers, if you allow at least like a 4 to 5 hour window to fully metabolize that caffeine before you bring in melatonin.
Great. Good idea.
Yeah,
Good.
see, there
Yep.
are
It's
so many
so many
different things,
nuances.
right? There
Yes.
is a lot of nuance, and that's why when people don't get the results initially, I ask them a couple of questions. Number one, how high was the dose? Number
Yeah.
two, what else was in that product? Because sometimes products are formulated with things that are actually accelerating or decelerating the metabolism of melatonin. Like when
Right.
you just see kind of a kitchen sink formula and there's like a bunch of stuff in there, it's like, wait a minute, there could be other stuff in there. The third thing I asked them is, what was the format? Like, was it a chewable? Was it a gummy? Was there a coating on it? Or is it just the straight up melatonin? And if it was a straight up melatonin, what form was that? Because much of the melatonin on the market, like 99%, if you just go to
Yeah.
Amazon, it's synthetically derived many times from different chemicals, right? So,
Yeah. And
I was
yours
talking,
is not. The herbitone is what's it derived from?
herbitonin is derived from
Herbitone.
rice, alfalfa, and chlorella.
Yeah.
Yeah,
That's the
so
only
it's
one I've ever seen that's derived from that.
right. And in some cases, there might be, I haven't looked lately, but whenever you see that term plant-based, go a little deeper
Okay.
because sometimes plant-based could mean that you have a corn or a soy starter compound, but then there's a chemical process. With herbitonin, that's just straight up plant material. That is that those plants were grown in an environment that maximized their endogenous melatonin production. Then that was harvested together with the cell concentrate from the plant. So it's not even an extract, it's just like the concentrate of the plant. And if you look at herbitonin, it's green. It's like a powdery
Yes, it
green
is.
material, right?
Yep.
So, and it's a super small capsule.
Very small.
Yeah, so very easy. And
Yeah.
that's the one that I like. And it is one of the few ones that have been tested side by side with synthetic melatonin. And again, the studies, well, this particular study showed that the herbitonin had a greater anti-inflammatory activity. And this was in a cell model looking at that. So it had up to 646% greater anti-inflammatory activity against synthetic melatonin. So like, let's just think about that.
Wow. Yeah.
Like that little, like side by side, same
Yeah.
amount,
Yeah.
but yet the herbitonin had, just over 6 times greater effect when it came to one of the enzymes that's pivotal in inflammation called COX-2.
This is why I was so excited to have you on, because you were the first person that I've ever heard talk about a plant-based melatonin. Like, I
Hmm.
had no idea that it could be derived out of a plant. So I was like, what? This is crazy. And then the very low dose, that it's 0.3 milligrams, because I searched online for a low dose melatonin. And this was before I heard of you. And then again, after I heard you talking, I went back on Amazon and tried to find a melatonin that was 1 milligram or less, which was near impossible.
Yeah.
All of them are higher dosed. I actually find too that 3 milligrams, I think, is mine too. My
Is
dose, my
it?
favorite.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
But I
I'm
do
actually
metabolize it fast.
right. Well, and you might want to constantly be on the pulse of that because I'm back to 0.3 milligrams. Like I had that patch of night sweats and hot flashes, and I don't have them anymore. That was like in the first 3 months of like where I was missing my period.
Mhm.
And now I'm in month 10 of missing my period. And I haven't had the hot flashes, night sweats now for a couple of months. So I've just gone back to the zero point 0.3 and I'm okay again. So it's just like, you might just have to adjust depending on what's going. Now, if I were going to travel, like I'm going to Peru in December, I'm going to take the higher dose.
Higher
But
dose. Yeah.
that's for a different reason. That is in order to help me with jet lag and to help me with just kind of getting into the rhythm of that day-night cycle.
But in the last 6 months, have you replaced your estrogen?
I do use bioidentical estrogen, and I
Yeah.
also use progesterone. I use
Yeah.
prometrium.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which I would think, because I know that there's a relationship even between estradiol and the production of melatonin. It's small, but it's there. I have to find exactly what, but I have it written down. I talked to Molly Eastman about it when I was on her podcast. So I was doing a bunch of research on it. And there is this kind of roundabout connection between you need a certain amount of estradiol basically to help with the production of melatonin in the system. There is a piece to that puzzle there.
Well,
But yeah,
that makes good sense
yeah, they're
because,
all connected.
overall, and I think because my hormones are just much more in line, and I also take another product. I take you and I were talking about
Yeah.
feminescence,
Yeah.
and I had that before I even started to do anything with bioidentical because I wanted to make sure again that I was patching the gaps. Like what feminescence does, I don't think people, if your listeners don't know what this is a very specific blend of maca that actually helps the brain to talk better to the ovaries to produce whatever estradiol could be produced by the body, and even progesterone, right? So it helps to kind
And
of
testosterone.
synchronize those, and testosterone, although there are different feminescence products, and certain ones of them are doing more on the estrogen and progesterone
Yeah.
side, and then
Yeah.
other ones are doing more on the testosterone side of things. So
Yeah, and on a side note, sorry to interrupt, just a side note for everybody, Feminescence is the number one maca that I recommend because it's the only one that has different strains for different places in your fertile life. So they'll have one specifically for
yeah.
fertile women, they have one for perimenopause, and they have one for menopause, and then they have one for a man. So this is what we're talking about.
Yes, thank you for
Just to be clear,
clarifying. And
yeah.
you're right. So essentially, there are 4 different products that are from maca, and different colors and phenotypes of maca in each one in order to address whatever functional need. So as I was going into perimenopause, I mean, I was already bringing in feminescence, and I think that that probably even delayed kind of
It
my
does.
entry
Yeah, it
in,
helps a lot.
because
Yeah.
one of the things I noticed about feminescence was, as I started to go a bit deeper, and right now I'm actually writing a manuscript on the colors of maca because I didn't even realize that there were 17 colors of maca that have been documented. And, certain
Fascinating.
ones of them grow in certain regions. And if you look at the kind that is grown in Peru at certain altitudes, they have different phytochemicals than the types of maca that would be like in China. So the soil, the altitude, the wind, the just the insects, the climate, the milieu, all of that is priming and changing the maca. That maca, depending on its phytochemicals that were derived from it, its experience in the environment, is then imparting function to our bodies. And there is this endocrine effect. So I got on that like straight away as I already felt like my hormones were changing, and I formed that base.
Mhm.
And in fact, like my estradiol levels were preserved for some time, and my progesterone as well, even though I have a family history of so many reproductive issues. And just even as a teenager, I just, if there's one system in my body that has been my biggest teacher, it's been my reproductive system. That's for sure.
Me too. Me too.
Well, that's why you have your podcast all about
Yes.
hormones, right? It's like, we're drawn to the things that are teachers for us. And
Yeah.
I used to think negatively about my body and my relationship to my menstrual cycle. Like when I was a
Yeah.
teenager, I mean, I just was in so much pain. I would sit out of school, physical activities. I mean, my life was really impacted by my relationship to my menses. But that
Mhm.
was because if I look back, it was how I was eating, it was how I was living.
Yeah.
If I could go back to my younger self and say, hey, wait, you don't have to be so debilitated. You don't have to like just feel like you're life is being drained out of you every month. This is what you need to do, but it is what it is. And I learned a lot. And now that's why I like to teach on this, because I do think that there's a way to get us optimized into the second half of our lives.
Absolutely. And this is what we're all about on this podcast. So, and I want to kind of take us back to the cortisol and melatonin, talking about these hormones and how they work together. Is there any research that shows, that if melatonin is being maybe taken from an outside source in those high doses, or if there's just the regular amounts of melatonin being produced, does it have like a seesaw relationship with cortisol, where if melatonin is coming on, does it automatically bring that cortisol down and vice versa?
I would think, to be honest, I haven't looked so deeply into the literature there, nor even, through clinical observations. I mean, I think, who could answer that really effectively would be the people at Dutch, Precision
Yeah.
Analytical, because
Yeah.
they would see a lot of these different panels. But here's what I do know. I do know that when cortisol is affected, if we go reverse, if we say like, well, when we see distortions in cortisol, do we see distortions in melatonin? And the answer would be yes, just based on, again, that kynurenine pathway, right? So I would assume that they're most likely, if people are changing melatonin by amping it up, you probably do change the cortisol and a lot of the different sex steroids as well, because they're all like very interlinked, right? So that's why, again, I just the other thing is that one thing we didn't talk about yet, but it enters into this, your question here, is that melatonin is an antioxidant. It's a pretty potent antioxidant.
Yep.
One molecule of melatonin can quench like 10 free radicals, whereas like something like vitamin C can quench like 1 to 2 free radicals. So it's pretty potent, and for certain radicals, it's even more potent than something like glutathione. So if you have too much of an antioxidant in an inflammatory or an oxidative stress milieu, you can change the dynamics. You can see even more potential pro-oxidant type of behavior. And that was seen, like I think about when I was in graduate school, because I studied the carotenoids like beta carotene. And I don't know if you remember the Finnish smoker study in the 1990s, but basically there were people who smoked, people who didn't smoke. They were given high doses of beta carotene, and the high dose beta carotene in the smoker was actually problematic. And I believe, just from my vague recollection going way back, they had increased rates of certain kinds of cancers like lung cancer. And so are we in an unhealthy milieu? If the body isn't healthy and we have a high dose of something that is not normally seen physiologically, how are we changing the dynamics, not only of hormones, but of the balance between pro-oxidants and antioxidants, right?
Yeah.
So I just want to enter that into the discussion, like too high of something in a milieu that isn't already healthy we don't know what the outcome of that could be. So
Yeah.
a big
Let's
question mark.
yeah, let's dummy this right down so that people get this. So melatonin is an antioxidant. We all want an antioxidant. That's healthy. It helps with oxidative stress. However, we don't want too much. Once again, Goldilocks amount. When you have too high amounts of antioxidants in your system, so you're taking all these supplements that are all antioxidants, thinking you're doing yourself a favor, and then plus you're taking 100 milligrams of melatonin, this then can start doing the reverse and causing problems. Is that
It could,
right?
it's an
Yeah.
unknown, because everybody, again, is so different. But imagine, I think that was one of the learnings from that study in the 90s about somebody with a lot of oxidative stress, like a smoker, but it could be an overexerciser who could have a lot of oxidative stress as well. Like it doesn't only have to be somebody with a lifestyle habit that would be seen as unhealthy. So any kind of oxidative stress, like somebody that would be hiking at high altitude would have more oxidative stress, or, limited, there would be a change in that dynamic, right?
Mhm.
So I think anytime, it's a little bit like, I think in the dietary supplement world or even in the health field, we have this idea that if a little is good, more is better.
Mhm.
And I can tell you, just even aside from melatonin and just looking at plants, more is not
Percent.
always, like
Yeah.
nature works with diversity. And this is why I really hearken back to things like traditional Chinese medicine, Ayurvedic medicine, where
Yes.
there was the appreciation, the honor, and the reverence of having a plant. Maybe you standardize to an active because you know that there's an active principle, but you have other things to help it along so that it doesn't go in the reverse direction, right? So that it kind of, and I think that when we just start to do silver bullets of
Yeah.
high doses of things without the complex array of different things that would connect to its safety profile, I guess the answer there is just it's a question mark. You don't know what could happen. I don't want to. Some people out there have been taking high dose melatonin and they swear by it and they say
Yep.
that, nothing's happened to them. And that's just, and so that's why I think that much depends on the context, much depends on the environment, also depends on the format of that melatonin.
Mhm.
But
Yeah.
I can just speak to me personally because we're not giving recommendations in this podcast, right? This is for educational use only. And if there's something here that tickles people's interest, they definitely need to be talking with their practitioner. And their practitioner hopefully is well informed from the science, safety margin and profile, looking at different manufacturers. I think that there's some personalized aspects that need to be considered there.
Yeah, I agree. And I think we always have to go back to kind of Mother Nature, and Mother Nature knows best. And yet at the same time, we're in 2023 and we've got all of this information and different things at our
It's
fingertips.
true.
And when you're dealing maybe with an illness or something's going on, like cancer or whatever it is, these kind of interventions of high dose melatonin and vitamin D and all the things that we've talked about here today, I think they have their place 100% because you can see that people have really positive reactions a lot of the time and it can help them to recover. It's that it should that then be done long term? I personally don't think so because then we're going to start affecting these other processes in the body, because it's not natural and they are
Yeah.
all working together. So we just have to be very aware of that and be very clear that this is what could happen. We're not exactly sure what, but we know that it could affect a person negatively over a long period of time. So just to be very careful and yes, work with a good knowledgeable practitioner that isn't maybe set in one way and that understands this, I think is important.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And understands your body
Mhm.
because just because somebody else can do 100 milligrams of melatonin doesn't mean that you can. One
Exactly.
other
Yeah.
thing is that there are a number of contraindications because melatonin, just like herbs, drugs, and foods can change melatonin metabolism, melatonin can change the metabolism of certain drugs. So if people are on medications, let's just say that they're on an antihypertensive, they're on maybe just even one or two medications, the melatonin may or may not impact. They should check with their pharmacist, but there could be some role there where now we start changing up the metabolism of certain drugs that we're taking. And I even say that sometimes for food. Food is
Yeah.
so powerful that, we have broccoli that could change. I mean, grapefruit juice, we know of the power of that to
Yeah.
change the certain drugs and their metabolism. So just know that, your body is very complex. It's a web. And again, if we pull on one part of the web, because we start to do something in higher amounts or in different ways, the whole web kind of changes, right? It distorts. It will move together with that signal.
Yeah.
So, but be judicious about all supplements you take, really. I mean, every
Yes.
day, be looking under the hood. Like, do I need this? Like,
Yeah.
one of them, like even omega-3s, just as an example, like just to go back to that, so many people do take fish oil, which I think is good. How many people actually get their omega-3 levels measured? Probably a
Yeah.
fraction,
Very few. Yeah.
right? And then they just keep taking the omega-3s without looking to see, like, did I go too far into omega-3, now I have an omega-6 imbalance, right? Because
Yeah.
all of those fatty acids, they all need to play together in balance. To
Once
me, what
again,
nutrition, nutrition has taught me that there is a science of relationship. Nothing is in isolation. Vitamin D is not in isolation. Melatonin is not in isolation. I mean, even a food, protein is not in isolation. Anytime we change and we go high protein, that means we're going low in something else, like
hmm
carbs or fat.
hmm
If we go low protein, we're going high in something else, like
carbs. Yeah.
carbs or fat. So it's just like it's a teeter-totter, it's a
Yeah.
pendulum, and things are always changing depending on what we're doing. So
Yeah.
if something is off with those high doses of whatever we're taking, definitely consult your healthcare practitioner.
Yeah. Okay. So where can people buy the herbatonin? Is it the same website as Feminescence?
Yes, so there is one website that you can go to. It's symphonynaturalhealth.com.
Okay.
Symphony, like the endocrine symphony in our body. I really like that
I like
metaphor.
that too. Yeah.
So
And I'll
on
link to
Symphony,
that in the show notes. And we'll have a coupon
perfect.
code. We haven't decided what that is yet. So by the
Yeah.
time that this airs, we'll have it in there. So there's going to be a coupon code. So if you guys want to try it, I've personally been taking it now for about a month. It's been great. I did have to go up in my dose as well as like how you had
You're a
to.
high metabolizer.
I will pay attention though. Maybe I won't need it, like
Yeah, you
who
might want to
knows?
evaluate that, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
just to
Just be
conserve.
aware.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Hmm.
exactly. Everything that we've talked about here today, I'll practice what I preach. That's amazing. I could just sit here and talk to you all day, and I think I'm going to have you come back and talk about maca because that could have been a whole podcast in
Oh
and of
goodness.
itself.
Yeah.
The power of maca, and I mean, I love maca. So, but we know melatonin is very widespread through the system. It is not just for sleep; it is also a very powerful antioxidant, amongst other things. So it's to be respected, and I think people will now, since they've now listened to this, that they'll be a little bit more on the lookout as to where it's being sourced from and how much they're taking, and I think that that's
Yeah.
really important. But thank you very much for coming on the show, and I look forward to having you back again. It was fascinating, and yeah, thank you.
What a delight. Thank you so much, Karen.